We're so excited to have our two esteemed presenters here this evening. Dr. Oswald Schmitz literally has a CV that's 31 pages long, and it's full and really interesting. He's currently at Yale as the Osler Professor of Population and Community Ecology, head of the Schmitz lab there. And a senior associate dean for research and director of doctoral studies in their School of the Environment. And notable to those of us in Ann Arbor, he received his doctorate from the School of Natural Resources here at the University of Michigan. His research helps explain how predator and herbivore species determine the species composition and productivity of plants and ecosystems, and his scientific insights help in the drive to conserve the essential services that species within ecosystems provide to humankind. His research evaluates how to rethink conservation strategies, offering alternatives to traditionally extensive and expensive approaches in environmental management. His newest book, and he has several, is called The New Ecology: Rethinking a Science for the Anthropocene, and is all about his studies on the linkage between biodiversity and ecosystems. We are also pleased to have Dr. Erick Lundgren with us this evening. Dr. Lundgren received his master's degree at Arizona State University and PhD from the University of Technology in Sydney. His research primarily focuses on ecosystems which have both native and introduced species, giving him a really important understanding of biodiversity and helping us all answer questions about not just what's happening now, but what's happened historically, even as far back as the Ice Age. And he's had a front seat into seeing different values that shape our science, which, while essential to guiding our responses to things like climate change, can also blind us in other ways. When Dr. Lundgren isn't studying interesting things like how donkeys dig wells that benefit other species, he's writing or presenting, but not with just peer-reviewed research, but also articles in Science, Smithsonian, Conservation Biology, and oodles of others. And I should mention he's been featured on Science Friday. I'm very jealous. Welcome to Dr. Lundgren. But first, our CEO and President, Tanya Hilgendorf, has a few words to share.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you everyone for being here tonight, and to our esteemed presenters. We are grateful for your valuable time and attention. We all know wildlife in Ann Arbor are a well-loved part of our community and our surrounding communities. Deer specifically are admired for their grace and their beauty and their gentle nature. Yet we also understand that living amongst wildlife can be messy and frustrating and even scary. Some may even believe wild animals don't belong in cities at all. Our discussion tonight isn't about biological overpopulation causing suffering or starvation, or public health or safety concerns. Those aren't our issues. But really, how do we best protect nature and life within, particularly in the face of climate change and mass extinctions, pollution, and the devastating loss of habitat and wildlife worldwide? Animals share our homes and our planet. They are our family and our neighbors. They make us happy and they help sustain life on Earth. But as the human population grows and development expands, we find ourselves in closer quarters and in more conflict with wildlife, facing critical questions of what we should do with animals, perhaps because of their species or their numbers, in places some just don't want them. Whether it's deer or coyote, geese or swan, or even our feline friends. How do we best understand their role and impact on our local ecosystems, our own role and effect on those systems? And how do we protect nature given all the threats that we know now exist today? Well, as they say, knowledge is power. So tonight we'll be hearing about some important research we may have not heard before or considered, the role of ethics in conservation, and how we might all, human and non-human animals, find a place of sustainability, respect, and peaceful coexistence. So with that, I will turn it over to the great Dr. Oz Schmitz.
Thank you very much, Tanya. I have very fond memories of Ann Arbor when I was a doctoral student there. So it's nice to visit, even though visiting through a crazy medium right now is the only way I could be there. But Anyway, I'm going to provide a brief presentation, a PowerPoint presentation. I don't want to drone on like a lecture, but I just want to present some ideas so that people can understand where I'm coming from in my thinking and why I approach, the whole issue of deer and deer management the way I do. So with that, I'm going to now launch the PowerPoint. I believe everybody can see that. Basically, the issue that typically I get called in to deal with is a question of should we cull or should we not cull deer? And it's usually pitched as sort of an idea of deer versus nature. That is, deer are having these huge negative, I drew the red arrow with a big minus sign, deer are having a negative effect on nature or biodiversity. And there's a clash of values. People worry about the health of the environment, the quality of nature, the abundance of different species, biodiversity, and there's this perception that deer are quite damaging to nature or biodiversity. The problem is a lot of times I find that nature or biodiversity is somewhat of a black box, and I'll get into that in a little later in the presentation when I try to unpack what I think is inside the black box. But to begin with, this whole idea of deer versus nature really results in the kind of thinking where as we increase deer abundance, or as deer abundance increases, we will see a decline in vegetation abundance because of what they eat, or loss of biodiversity as we increase deer abundance because there are a lot of other species that rely on the vegetation for their habitat. So as deer increase abundance, they destroy the environment, and therefore we should get rid of them or reduce their population so that we can bring things back up to higher levels of vegetation or biodiversity. And the way people often really look at the impacts of deer is through browse surveys, right? They want to provide evidence, which you need to make informed decisions. They bring in data from browse surveys where they go in the field and look at how much vegetation is eaten by deer. And this is a typical example of a heavily browsed stem. And then there's the lightly browsed stem here where you don't see a lot of bushiness. This is what we call coppicing. And so what happens is when things are heavily browsed, the plants compensate by growing more twigs, and then the deer eat more, and then it becomes a really bushy twig as opposed to this thin twig. And oftentimes, you see heavy browsing. The problem the problem with these kinds of measurements, though, is you have to rely on the vegetation that's available in the field, in the stand or in a site. And that can sometimes vary in palatability. So deer may have different impacts, not because of differences in abundance of vegetation, but maybe some are more palatable than others. And so they have different preferences and forage differently. And so to get around that, there's another technique now. It's called Sentinel Plants. And what people do is they grow seedlings, tree seedlings, and take them and plant them in different sites. And they either plant them in the open or surround them with cages to exclude deer. And then what they do is they compare the browse impact between the two. And this is a very useful and highly appropriate scientific technique to really gauge the impact and not have it, what we say scientifically, confounded by the site conditions, because you're presenting the same kind of food in all different kinds of habitats. And it's a good indicator of browsing impact. Now, the thing we have to keep in mind is this is a browse study. It's not a regeneration study, though. So this is a way of just measuring what deer are doing in terms of their impact. And you can also then compare that to and identify what other species might be eating the seedlings and determine how much deer are having an impact versus other species. And so what you often expect is that in those exclosures that I showed you, the cages around the trees that prevent deer from eating, you would expect high plant height or abundance. And then outside of these exclosures where deer are present, you should see less vegetation. It makes intuitive sense. It's, think about a candy. candy jar or a cookie jar. If the jar stays closed and you can't get in, all the cookies are in. If you open the cookie jar and start eating the cookies, there are fewer cookies. That's sort of the idea. And this was exactly the kind of study that Dr. Jacqueline Courteau did in this area in Ann Arbor, a sentinel study to really measure the impact. And certainly, yes, she discovered that deer, when they're present or have access to the vegetation, they can have a pretty important impact on that. The limitation of that kind of study, though, is certainly you know what the vegetation should be when there are no deer, but when you have deer present, you don't know where along this axis you are here. And so you don't know if this is just a few deer or if it's many deer doing this damage. And so it becomes really hard to justify a cull based on this because you only have 2 data points. What you really need is to see if there is this linear trend between deer abundance. So what you have to do is this kind of study across a widely varying abundance of deer on the landscape in order to be able to argue that, yes, lowering deer abundance will actually end up improving the environment. So my experience, I actually did this with a master's student of mine back in 2008 and 2009. The article was published in 2010. And basically what we did was really go on a landscape level and look at the browsing impact and the regeneration impact across that landscape, ranging from low to high deer abundance. And I'll show you in a minute what that really means in terms of numbers. But we did it over the Western Connecticut landscape, where this is different land cover types, where green is forest, red is more very urban environment, and the yellow in there is ex-urban environment. And you can see here, there's a widely varying deer density here from hot spots to cold spots, if you will, or very low densities. And so what we did was sample plots in towns within each of these zones here. These are actually counties within the state. And we picked certain towns within each of these and then measured vegetation in 10 large plots within each of those town areas. And so the density that we're talking about is a maximum of 30, where it's really dense, to a low of 5 deer per square mile in the northern part of the state. And so what we looked at was the stem density in 400 meter square plots. And we looked at both woody seedlings. So this would be looking at the regeneration stage, and we also looked at cover of trees in the plots. And what you find actually is that, yes, indeed, there's a lot of varying damage here, right? So sometimes you have 93 seedlings per plot, and then sometimes you only have as few as 46.1. It's hugely variable at the seedling stage, but it's not highly variable at the tree stage. So in other words, deer impacts here potentially do not affect the tree abundance here. There's regeneration happening even though there's variable amounts of woody seedlings present. And the reason why that's happening is just a basic ecological principle of self-thinning. So what happens is, especially when you're using hardwood trees like red oaks and things like that, or working in those kinds of forests, as you know, they've massed. There are seasonal boluses of acorns that hit the ground, and those acorns exceed the number that could possibly establish and grow in that landscape. And so a lot of them died before they even become seedlings, but there's still even a lot of seedlings that actually become established. But those seedlings, even if there was no herbivory, those seedlings would die because of competition. And it's the forest that's self-thinning that ends up reaching and creating this little variability at the tree stage. And so again, what's happening here is we can see deer damage, but deer may not necessarily preclude the forest from regenerating. The other issue is the browse impact is a snapshot. And it's only one side of the story. As I said, it's a browsing survey. It's not a regeneration survey. And so we can ask ourselves, what about regrowth or the productivity of that forest? And what you have to do then, and one useful way of doing that is what's called a cover board technique, where basically if you look at these two kinds of stands right here, this one obviously has no understory. There are no seedlings growing up into the canopy. Whereas you can see here in the left figure here, there's a lot of different height, vegetation at different heights in this canopy. And so with a coverboard technique, what you do is you put the coverboard in behind the vegetation and you stand and look at the coverboard and estimate how much of the coverboard at different heights is obscured by the vegetation. And so if a lot of it is covered all the way up the entire profile, then you will have what's called a high foliage height diversity index. And if there is no coverage because of the openness, then you would have a low foliage height diversity index. And this is an indicator of how much forest regeneration is happening. If it's high, you've got good regeneration. If it's low, you wouldn't have any regeneration. And so what you might expect is that in areas where you have low deer abundances, you have very high foliage height diversity versus low foliage height diversity where deer are highly abundant. So we sampled across these sites, 10 plots in each of the towns we looked at. And again, I haven't drawn lines here because there's no relationship between the index of deer density and foliage height diversity. And this is just a summary across all towns because densities differed across the towns here also in terms of the mean and variance. So there is no negative relationship. Deer density is not a good indicator of the damage that you're going to see or the lack of regeneration or whatever you measure, right? So, the arguments then are always, okay, maybe they aren't impacting regeneration, but maybe they're affecting forest biodiversity or causing loss of native plants to invasive plants. And so you can also break things down. You can look at the vegetative cover, the species richness, that is the diversity by species identity of the different plant species in the forest, or the species evenness, that is how equally different species are represented, right? You could, it accounts for the dominance of different species. The percentage of ornamentals, these are the invasives that escape from people's gardens potentially. The number of native plants or the percentage of native plants in these areas. And basically what this value here, this R² value indicates is how reliable, how important deer are in terms of explaining variation in each of these factors. A number close to 1 would mean deer are really, 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 really important. The fact that you get some numbers that are really tiny, and the fact that all of the numbers are less than 0.5, if you will, means that deer are having very little or no effect, even on the biodiversity across the Connecticut landscape, based on the surveys we've done. So the other issue that comes up, so in Connecticut, you could argue that a cull would not necessarily change any of the variables that I talked about, right? But even if people call for a cull, what's often frustrating for me when I get called in to give advice is people aren't clear about what goals they have. What are the measurable outcomes, right? It's typically deer are damaging biodiversity. Okay, so if we cull the deer, we'll get more biodiversity, but how much biodiversity is enough? And what do you mean by biodiversity? How much more do you want in terms of a goal? And because these goals are nebulous, you never really know how much culling you need to do to achieve any objective. And so, what we need to do is really clarify what our objectives are. One could be that we just want maximum forest cover where you don't have any deer. Or you might want deer at carrying capacity. And when you're dealing with hunters, they like to have a lot of deer. So you want deer close to carrying capacity, or maybe you want something in between also. And so it's really, really crucial to clarify what your measurable outcomes are. Otherwise, you will never know whether you're achieving them, and you will waste taxpayers' money in doing deer culls because you'll never know whether you've achieved your objectives or not. Now, if we're wanting something in between, like maximizing biodiversity or whatever, then here's where we have to really look inside the black box and think about the ecology of the situation. And so for me, I don't think of deer versus nature. I actually think deer are part of nature. They are biodiversity. They're part of biodiversity. And what what inspires me as an ecologist is really to look at this complexity head on and try and understand the complexity and really look into the black box and try and understand what's going on. And one of the things we know is that it's dynamic. That black box is dynamic. Where you are in the black box depends on the habitat structure or the state of forest succession. And just to give you a sense of dynamism, you might have learned even in high school ecology that there's this idea of succession where you have, open bare ground is primary succession where plants fill in eventually, and then eventually one kind of plant, let's say grasses or low shrub, give way to higher shrubs, and eventually you get forest infilling. And so in certain stages of forest development, you have what's called horizontal structure, where you just have everything at the same height. The plant diversity might be pretty low because you've got sort of monocultures or a few species of pioneering species, and eventually you end up with both horizontal structure and vertical structure as a diversity of plants come in and invade and take over for others. And then eventually succession takes you to this canopy where you just have vertical structure and you have less diversity again, potentially. And notice there are no shrubs in the understory here or vegetation, even in an ecological situation where you don't necessarily have deer as part of it. Then you also have different biodiversity associated with these different states. And this is what I mean by clarifying your objectives of what biodiversity you want. Do you want certain kinds of bird species that are associated with this early habitat? Or do you want species associated with this other habitat? And then do you want high biodiversity, or are you happy with just a certain amount of biodiversity? Because across this successional gradient, what you find is biodiversity, which includes the vegetation species as well as the animal species, rises, peaks, and then declines as the forest matures again. So just by culling deer doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have more diversity, right? So the other issue then, obviously, is when you're thinking about the structure, the evidence that's often used to argue for deer that are resting forest regeneration may be confounded by the successional state where the pictures or the measurements are taken. So in this scene here, if you just sort of look at the land and train to look at the land, you have a pretty dense canopy cover here, something akin to this. Whereas here you can still see light gaps, lots of light gaps, and not many stems like this, maybe one here, but there's a lot of less dense less thick stems here, which might be more reminiscent of this stage. So you're actually comparing potentially two different successional states here, and not necessarily what deer are doing in this environment. But is the claim that, I want to address the claim that deer are causing loss of biodiversity. And here's the issue again, as I pointed out, biodiversity is often used in such a broadly sweeping way, it often doesn't inform any measurable outcomes. And so what you could risk is that, if this forest that you're working with or the vegetation you're working with is here, culling deer might enhance diversity because you allow succession to proceed a lot faster and you might enhance diversity. But if you're at this stage of succession and you cull deer, then the forest will continue to grow and you could collapse biodiversity if you count animals and plants this way. And again, I just want to highlight that we have to be really clear by what we mean by biodiversity to get the measurable outcomes that we're looking for. Now, the other thing that we have to really think about, and this is the issue where I come from and really sort of wrestled with, is that we have a lot of forest cover in Connecticut, right? And if you go to this part of the state, it's really green. There's a band here where there's a high density of humans, where human habitation is. And if you look at where the deer are, the highest deer densities are actually where the highest densities of humans tend to be. They're not up in the forests here, right? They're not in the rural areas. They're attracted for some reason down here into the dense human density, high areas of human density. And so what it seems here is that deer in Connecticut are actually preferring to live near humans because of the association of of human density and deer density we see in this state. Now, this is where we actually have to think about another factor that determines where deer are, and this is called deer settling stimulus. The wildlife literature hasn't entertained this much. It's an idea that comes out of Europe. And it's really thinking about the thermal cover, not just the forage availability, but the thermal cover that deer prefer. And so if you have high canopy cover, this is like a green barn. And so it's optimal for deer in certain seasons because it provides them thermal protection from the elements. And the shrubby environment is second best. So an open environment obviously is not thermally good for deer, thermally advantageous for deer. And so when you look at where deer are in the course of forest succession, you do find them in areas where you have habitat cover interspersed with more open cover where their forage is. And so this is a landscape dynamic that we actually have to understand. Deer will hang out in here, move out and forage here and move back and shuttle back and forth. It's a landscape dynamic. The deer settling stimulus in the urban environment comes about when we have forest or woodlot patches in urban neighborhoods, like a lot of green forest interspersed with more open lawns and pavement and gardening. You get high deer densities. When you don't have that kind of mosaic, then you end up having fewer deer on the landscape. Here's an aerial shot of the greater Ann Arbor area, and this is what I mean. We've got a mosaic of habitation with human habitation, forest cover interspersed with open areas. This is really ideal deer habitat. This habitat here is created by us as people. Our landscape planning, our land use planning has created this kind of environment. It's actually the kind of environment deer love. And this is one reason why deer love to be near people, because people create the environment that they thrive in the best. And so what we actually really need to think about in the bigger picture of biodiversity is not deer versus nature, but it's really humans versus urban and ex-urban nature. And again, the reason I'm saying urban and ex-urban nature and not wilderness is because I also consider urban realm and the ex-urban realm nature. It's part of nature. It's just a different instantiation of nature. Nature isn't just wilderness. It's the environment that we are part of, regardless of where we live on this planet. And so if we start looking into the black box again and really trying to understand what we're doing, oftentimes what I think is happening is deer are becoming a convenient scapegoat for things that we have caused as people. We've created the environment for deer to thrive, and then we start blaming the deer for causing the damages that we encourage them, in fact, to create, because we created the living conditions for them to flourish really well. Now, culling is one solution here, but the problem is, and this is Ann Arbor is facing the same kinds of issues that they are in Essex County in New Jersey, but Essex County in New Jersey has an additional problem in that they're calling for deer culling. But if you really look at the collapse of forest understory, and there is a collapse of forest understory as opposed to this luxuriant base of young seedlings. And here's an example of the self-thinning, right? Here's a whole bunch of seedlings, but you can see the canopy trees are much fewer. So that's the self-thinning that leads to that. But anyway, here's evidence where deer aren't having an impact and people are blaming deer for this impact, but it turns out it's an invasive jumping worm introduced from Asia. And what this thing does is it basically decomposes all of the organic matter that really is the duff layer that allows roots to thrive and the plant roots to be protected and allows the trees to grow. It turns it into this gravelly mess. It looks like actually coffee grounds, and it's got the consistency of coffee grounds, and roots can't stick in there, right? It's because of this invasive jumping worm. The source of the spread is soil and compost from garden centers and landscapers for gardening and landscape plantings, right? The solution here, they're still calling for culling deer. Culling deer is going to be a waste of taxpayers' money because that's not going to fix the problem. And that's what I mean by thinking about the complexity in the black box and really trying to understand what is causing what and not scapegoating certain species. And then this gets to the bigger environmental ethical conundrum. If we're thinking about urban environments as nature, and we are coexisting with other species in nature, what do we do next for other unwanted species? Do we cull predators like foxes and coyotes that are in our landscapes that actually, it turns out that in urban environments, predators thrive better than in wilderness because of what we do to the landscape and the garbage and the food waste that we leave on the landscape. Predators in urban environments are actually better off than in wilderness. Same as rodents. Do we poison unwanted rodents? What about the rest of biodiversity? What do we do? You know, my worry here is there's this cascade of value, or that's basically says, okay, whenever a species gets in our way, get rid of it. Pretty soon you won't have any biodiversity if you take that attitude. And so I think we really actually have to think about the ethics that are related to this too. And Erick's going to speak to some of that a little more. So, you know, what I think we need to do is really start reimagining us within, not outside. Deer aren't outside of nature. We're all part of nature within urban and ex-urban nature. And we also have to appreciate that, you know, the kinds of things we do to the environment to change the environment can also feed back to affect us as part of the food web or part of that nature. And so that also raises bigger questions about environmental justice issues, right? If we're doing things to the environment that cause feedbacks in certain neighborhoods or certain parts of the community then are ill affected by what we do, that's an environmental justice issue. And so, you know, to me, thinking a little more broadly, thinking more comprehensively, thinking about all the dimensions here, not just a deer problem, it's an ecological issue, and thinking about ways that we might encourage coexistence, it might be a better way to go about addressing some of these problems. I really do think that, you know, by taking that kind of approach and really thinking about different potential goals or objectives and clarifying what those are, and then identifying measurable outcomes allows us to do different management interventions that then lead to the kinds of measurable outcomes that we're looking for. And it doesn't necessarily always mean deer culling, right? So by understanding all of these linkages and effects, it helps clarify what our goals are, what our management interventions could be. So for example, if you want to lower deer abundances in urban environments, I wouldn't say shoot them, get rid of the settling stimulants, you know, change the structure of the landscape in terms of the habitat that we create and the kinds of plantings, especially plants that deer love to eat outside of the habitats in which they get thermal protection. That may be a different way and maybe a more environmentally friendly way than just killing the deer. But we should have measurable outcomes. What are we expecting if we do that? The point I'm trying to make is what this does is it increases the dimensionality of potential solutions to fix the problem. We don't just use one size fits all culling. We think about the bigger picture and maybe come up with creative solutions. And what I like about this is it actually allows partnerships among people who historically might not have worked together and maybe not seen eye to eye. And we can come together and actually be creative and find common ground this way. And it also ultimately increases our ethical environmental awareness about how best to be stewards of all of nature and not just pick and choose. And so I'll leave it with there. I'm happy to answer questions or engage in discussions, but I think Erick is next off. So thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It was really interesting, and I admittedly I really want to see that jumping worm. A reminder, pictures later. A reminder to the audience that if you have questions for any of our presenters, please pop them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And next we have Dr. Erick Lundgren, who will be having a conversation with Tanya Hilgendorf.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Schmitz, so much. That was very eye-opening. Dr. Lundgren, we do want to talk a little bit more about ethics that Dr. Schmitz touched upon. Some of those who oppose the cull and killing healthy animals in general myself included, often get accused of being focused on feelings versus science. Does science tell us what's good or bad, and how do we decide what action to take based on results that we get?
Hi, Tanya, and hi, everybody else. And first of all, I am not an ethicist. I'm an ecologist, but the stuff I've worked on has made me engage with, to some extent, with ethicists and with thinking about values and thinking about what this question that you're asking right there. I remember, as a graduate student and as an undergrad and as a practitioner of conservation, constantly hearing this term of ecosystem health, that there was this right way for the world to be and this wrong way for it to be. But you can't actually, what is that? And I thought for a long time that there was some kind of scientific reality to that scientists knew how the world should be, because that's how people discuss it. But that's actually a value. And whenever we talk about should, we're actually talking about ethics. So science can tell you how many trilliums there are in a forest, plus or minus some degree of error, because we're not omnipotent and omniscient. And it can tell you how many deer, and it can tell you how those deer are affecting trilliums, but it can't tell you if that's good or bad. Scientists could tell you if the Earth is dead and black and lifeless, or if it has a verdant forest and biodiversity, but it can't say one of those is better than the other. That is ultimately a thing you can make an ethical claim about, which we are in the business of doing, but we need to do it with a clarity that we're not speaking science, that we're speaking something else.
Sort of on that point, historically, folks may be aware or not aware that conservation and wildlife management has a long and often ugly history of destroying whatever is considered surplus, whether that's or invasive or holding more monetary value, dead than alive, or just sort of in the way. Can you touch a little bit on the history of conservation and invasion biology and the challenges you see in the narratives, the ethics, and the approach to research?
Yeah, I'd love to. So conservation biology it's an applied scientific discipline. It's like medicine. Medicine is to the human body, it's an extension of biology focused on the human body. And conservation biology is an extension of ecology that's concerned with other organisms and with the earth. But it's implicitly value laden. And it needs to be, because values are how we decide what to do. We decide not to clear cut a forest because we value that forest. And we can make different arguments about why we value that forest. But conservation biology, its founding premises, and the ones we've been trained in, do not look at individual organisms as having value intrinsically. Conservation biology is focused on collectives, so populations, species as having value, whereas individual deer, their lives, they do not have an intrinsic right to life as an individual in the way conservation biology has long been described. A bigger issue is that conservation biologists are not taught that conservation biology is value laden. We're taught as if, this is some kind of essential truth, but it's not. There are many environmental ethicists, though, and people in conservation biology that are questioning this. This heritage that we have in conservation biology is not really surprising. Our culture, a lot of the European cultures, going back to the ancient Greeks, have seen non-human life as having no intrinsic value, as being mechanical, as being machines. And this has been, broadly questioned by new science and by, beginning to respect other forms of knowledge and culture that we've, from indigenous societies and from other religions, which has led us to a little bit more open perspective towards what is the value of an individual deer. And I would say that most of us here, when we love our dog or our cat, we don't love them because they're an instance of their type, or that because they represent a species or an object of evolution, but we love them as individuals. And we recognize, of course, that a coyote or a deer individual has, it has an inner world just like our dog does. And so incorporating those perspectives in conservation is sort of a new thing that is causing a lot of discourse and some challenges because it questions a lot of the ways we do our work, which has been very much about killing things.
Mhm, mhm. One of the things I find sort of personally and politically troubling is the what we consider native and invasive. So I'll say, you know, my grandparents were immigrants from Sicily. They're not native and faced a lot of xenophobia when they came here, a lot of prejudice. And I feel like the language is very similar. It seems filled with sort of hate for species and scapegoating. That's, you know, one of my concerns. And I feel like deer, even though they are native, they somehow are getting treated in the same sort of way, that we end up pitting deer who've been here for millions of years against native species or plant species such as Trillium, and how we're picking between those. Can you talk just about that negative lens that I feel like Dr. Schmitz also touched on, and the problem with that viewpoint?
Yeah, I mean that's really what, you know, I went to undergrad at Earlham College in Indiana, so similar neck of the woods as Michigan in some ways, a little bit more corn and soy maybe. And I was a, you know, a devout believer in invasion biology. I spent, you know, my weekends out killing honeysuckle and pulling up garlic mustard. You know, and that narrative really fit into how I thought about the world in a very, you know, easy, instinctive way, that there were certain organisms that didn't belong and that nature was this kind of perfectly balanced system. And then this new thing comes in and everything falls apart. You know, it was not until later that that narrative started to fall apart. And, you know, there's so many, I could talk about this for hours, but I'm not going to. Um, but, you know, one really interesting thing about it is that when you describe an organism as an invader, as if it built ships to rape and pillage and kill, you completely constrain the types of questions you can imagine asking about that organism. You can't study an organism objectively if you hate it, I don't think. And so what we found is that when you know, there's so much research now that has looked at these, you know, so-called invasive species. Like imagine feral pigs, you know, one of the most hated species. About half the studies on their effects on vegetation show that they increase plant diversity. And there are studies in the Great Smoky Mountains that show that by rooting soils, they increase tree growth rates. In Australia, where they root, becomes these foraging hotspots for parrots and other birds because they expose termites and fruits and seeds. So there's all these interesting, complicated ecological stories that are completely hidden because of this framing, this anthropomorphization, which is so funny because as scientists, as biologists, we're taught not to anthropomorphize organisms to have feelings or to have thoughts. We're taught that to be a good biologist, you have to think of organisms as machines. But then we've anthropomorphized entire ecological processes and entire species, which is, I think, a little ridiculous. But I do think that the tides of that way of studying the world are changing, luckily. You know, and to get back to deer, you know, I've with my PhD advisors, we often talked about how conservation biologists are terrified by two things, and that's rarity and thriving. When an organism begins to do well or is doing well somewhere, we panic without really asking questions about why or how or in which places is it doing well and in what distribution. And I'm not sure if I answered all your questions there, but
Yes,
feel free to go back.
no, that's very helpful. So when we talk about, you talked about balance. So, you know, we had some aerial surveys for deer, 100 to 200 deer in and around the community, in a community of 200,000 residents, students, commuters, their cars, their lawns, their houses. But we hear that deer are out of balance. That's something we hear quite a bit. Due to the lack of predators is what folks talk about. although I think they might be missing the fact that we haven't had, they talk a lot about wolves, and we haven't had wolves here for a century in this area. But we do have coyote, and they are natural predators. But as is common with culling, there was, as Dr. Schmitz stated, never a goal stating on how many deer we'd need to put it back in balance after being out of balance. And the culling was just based on, frankly, how many we could feasibly kill without getting too close to homes and schools. I mean, I don't think folks would argue with that. So I guess my questions in that are, can you talk about some more of the problems with arbitrary population goals and the idea that nature is always perfectly balanced and diverse, particularly in a fragmented urban area with lots of other human activity going on?
Sure, I'm happy to take a stab at that. And Oz pointed to, in his excellent presentation, pointed to dimensions of this, how many trilliums should there be? And when I use the word should, I'm making an ethical claim that there is a right number of trilliums. And how many deer should there be? And how many red oak seedlings should there be? And how should they look? These are all ethical claims, and there's no biological way to say one of those claims is right or wrong, because it has nothing to do with it. If you did a study, you could show that chickadees are overabundant and predating too many important forest seeds, and therefore should be culled as well. And just as Oz alluded to, we could end up in a world where every single species needs to be killed to maintain some degree, some idea that's our idea of how the world should be. And I find that really sociopathic and disturbing. The idea that nature exists in a balance is an artifact of old Western ideas about nature. Ecologists carried this baggage around for a long time, with various ideas of this kind of superorganismic ecological succession, where species move together as a super community and are perfectly co-evolved. But these ideas have all fallen apart. If you look back in time, communities have changed drastically and are changing and will always change. That is maybe the only constant. And one thing, the way that this works, though, that is key and often forgotten, because this is something that other sciences don't really have to wrestle with, is scale. So one of the most incredible things about ecosystems is that these scale-dependent processes are happening. And in that heterogeneity, and this is a word that we love, but me and Oz may be the only people here that use this word on a regular basis. Heterogeneity is the idea of diversity, differences between places. And that varies based on the scale of your measurement. So if I went into the Great Plains and zoomed in on a meter square of where a bison had wallowed, I would find 0 plants, no plants. And I could focus on that meter scale and say that bison are destroying the Great Plains. They are an absolute horrible species, 0 plants, bison kill everything. But if I zoom out, that little meter patch of bare ground is actually this really important and distinct habitat for certain organisms. It collects water, and it increases landscape scale diversity, heterogeneity, in reference to the places that aren't wallowed on. So, I looked at some of these browsing studies in Ann Arbor, and you have some forests where some 80% of the oak transplants were browsed. And then other forest plants where only 20% were browsed. And not only, as Oz pointed out, does that not necessarily reflect regeneration, but also in the context of the Ann Arbor ecosystem, having that difference of 20% to 80% browse rates increases the landscape scale diversity. So what we find is that diversity and coexistence between organisms really depends on scale, and having enough places with different types of conditions for organisms to choose to be. And this is not only spatially, but temporally. So you may have really strong deer browsing pressure right now. Like my brother lives on one of the islands in the Puget Sound, Orcas Island. And the first few years I was there helping him build a yurt, there were deer everywhere. They eat out of your hands. And the understory, the tons of browsing pressure, but still very beautiful and still regeneration happening, but tons of browsing pressure, people were concerned. And then all of a sudden there was a disease and 90% of the deer died. And now there's a whole new wave of different plants showing up. And it's within these temporal and spatial scales that you see how ecosystems actually work. There is no such thing as this localized balance.
Mhm, mhm. When we talk about that complexity and our own impact on some of those systems that Oz touched on, Ann Arbor does regular controlled burns.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering how those controlled burns might impact the natural areas themselves and the deer behavior.
Well, that's a really interesting thing because I grew up in New York State and no one burns around here. So it's interesting that they're burning in that environment. And I would love to know the outcome of that. What I know from the literature is that, burns can be really important for some organisms. And when prescribed burning became this thing to do to increase diversity, people started applying it across entire landscapes, entire grasslands, or entire shrublands. And what they actually found was the opposite of what they wanted. The way fire, again, really can promote biodiversity, if that's what you want to do, is through increasing heterogeneity. Having patches that burn and patches that don't burn in the same landscape, because then species can select where they want to be. I'd also note that burning is a really good way to increase the palatability of foods for herbivores like deer, and also to kill trilliums and many seedlings. So if those are your concerns, maybe think about the burning as opposed to making a pile of dead deer.
Mhm, mhm. When we talk about predation and there not being any wolves or coyotes or not sort of respecting coyotes, you may know that Michigan has year-round open season on coyote, and there's a great deal of coyote hate when we think about scapegoating particular species. And I know that Ann Arbor does allow some hunting of coyote on its areas as well. So can you talk just about, do humans substitute apex predators well? Like, do we have to be the wolves, and do we do a good job at being the wolves in the same way the wolves would do it? And how might killing coyote impact not just deer population, but the ecosystem in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way predators influence prey is, of course, really complicated. People often think about it in terms of numbers, right? So they think that since there's predators there, they're going to reduce the number of deer or elk, and that's going to lead to increased plant recruitment, and then increased songbirds or whatever, all these cascades. But, at least in my read of the literature, and I would love to hear Oz's perspective on this, a lot of the effects, and this is my personal research too, on wild burros or donkeys, a lot of the effects of predators emerge not just from direct effects on population size, but by the prey changing their behavior. And these are called indirect trophic cascades or behaviorally mediated trophic cascades. And the way we term this is that these predators create a landscape of fear. That there are certain areas that are more risky for the prey than other areas. And so these animals will have to navigate between their food requirements and safety. And in doing so, you create refuges from herbivory. And that increases this thing I've been talking about of landscape heterogeneity. And so does human hunting do that? I think sometimes it can. But it depends. I do not know if culling does that. If you're trying to indiscriminately kill a population, and you're creating ways to do that really effectively, I don't know if you're creating a predictable environment for deer to respond to in the way that a wolf would or a coyote would. Another thing that's important is even if coyote populations are stable and high with this hunting pressure on them, it doesn't mean that their ecological effects haven't changed from being hunted. My PhD advisor did a lot of work in Australia with dingoes, and dingoes are shot and poisoned, at a horrific scale. And in many of these places, you don't see an ecological effect of dingoes on these prey. There's abundant dingoes, they're all being poisoned, they're all being shot. But if you go to places where dingoes are protected, they actually start to form packs that are socially stable. and they start to learn how to hunt larger animals. So in places where they're poisoned, they might be living on rodents. But in places where they're protected, they learn how to hunt donkeys, wild donkeys, and wild camels. So their ecological effects are actually they're actually cultural. They're not just intrinsic to the species. And that's something we forget about if we think about managing ecosystems by numbers. And again, this relates to us thinking about animals as machines.
Agreed. Agreed.
And one other aspect of this too, which I meant to mention earlier, is that with these trillium and oak studies, one big question I had is how these sites were selected and how these forests are managed in the first place. There's a number of great studies that show that if there are coarse woody debris, if trees are allowed to fall down and die, you get refuges for seedlings and for trilliums and all these plants that might be deer sensitive, because deer aren't going to get into that wood. So there's many, as Oz was mentioning about how we can care for our landscapes as being the ultimate driver of deer populations. The way we actually tend our forests, both through fire and through wood clearing, are going to have huge effects on things like trillium and oak and their interaction with deer.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit more about your own research as it relates to introduced herbivores and the role you see in restoring some ecological functions lost after extinctions, and what that could possibly tell us about other large herbivores like deer in places we think they just don't belong?
Yeah, so I'm happy to. I don't want to distract too much from the cervid question, the deer questions. But when I was young, I was strongly influenced by the realization that North America had as many large herbivores or more as Africa. We had mammoths and gomphotheres and ground sloths and camels and 3 to 5 species of horse and more species of deer and glyptodonts, just a crazy diversity of big plant-eating animal. And this is so contradictory to the way I think the world should be, because I grew up in this, I'm saying the word should intentionally here, because I have internalized as a child and as a student of ecology a vision of nature that is very quiet. It's the peaceful forest, it's the quiet wetland, it is the subtle shy deer that you barely see just slipping out of sight. But the world actually, for millions of years, from starting around 45 million years ago, when these big animals show up in the fossil record, not long after the dinosaur extinctions, the world was dominated by tons of herbivore biomass. And most of the world would have been trampled and eaten, which is just crazy, because our vision of the way the world should be is where herbivory is almost negligible. We have a very plant-focused should in terms of how we think the world should be. And so one thing that I found really interesting, and I moved out west doing field work for various organizations in these areas where there were wild donkeys, wild burros, and I can't roll my R's, so wild. I'm going to say burro wrong, but and these animals are functionally and morphologically very similar to equids that were once in North America. In the West there were 3 to 5 species at least of these animals, and so I just became fascinated with these escaped slaves, basically these animals that were used in the mines and now are wild, that most ecologists study as pests. What are they actually doing, and are they doing things that were once on this landscape? And not really knowing if I would ever study this, I stumbled upon them digging to water. So these animals dig wells to groundwater in the desert, and in many places this is the only water available in the summer dry season. And so it's a very simple thing. I put cameras on these, and yes, turns out they're used by pretty much every organism in there. And this is one of those interesting things where this phenomena was hiding in plain sight and only hidden because of our normative values about them belonging or not. These are very non-scientific ideas about how the world should be.
Really, really fascinating. When we talk about the values that you bring up so eloquently and philosophy, we know that the scientific community denied animal sentience. You talked about this, and sapience, only seeing them as sort of automatons or tools without ability to think or feel. And Darwin told us nearly 200 years ago that animals are really our evolutionary cousins with personality and cognitive ability and complex emotional response. What that brings up for me is a concern about when conservation says individual life doesn't matter or that we must kill for the greater good. How are we just undermining the overall purpose of conservation, which I think is to preserve life?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I think people could formulate the purpose of conservation in different ways, right? But for me, conservation, thinking about if we're arguing that people should, stop, lose their jobs to protect forests, or sacrifice or change their habits to protect non-human life, and then we're also saying that life is mechanical, there's a cognitive dissonance there. And it isn't what drives me as a conservationist. I feel like conservation is more than the preservation of a bunch of objects. We're more than, protecting Greek antiquities or kitchen appliances from the 1950s. This is something more. And for me, conservation is trying to find ways for humans and the non-human to thrive together. And that comes intrinsically out of a respect for non-human life. And it can't just be treating them as numbers in pursuit of some kind of nebulous idea of, some people describe conservation as, maximizing the ecosystem services that the non-human world provides to humans. This very utilitarian approach. But that approach, if we find out that, whatever species doesn't contribute any monetary value to humans, and what do? Do we just kill it? Is this really what motivates people that care about the non-human life, about the health of these, whatever health is, about the forests of Ann Arbor? I don't think it is. And so there's a cognitive dissonance there between the way we have been acting and I think what we actually believe and feel and the values that we hold as a society together. And I think we need to be more explicit about those values and have these discussions more transparently than we have until this point.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the values are critical, but we also know that the science, Dr. Schmitz highlighted, it's also kind of sketchy. A paper, Dr. Lundgren, you recently shared with me discussed our lack of understanding around natural baselines for large herbivores, including white-tailed deer, and how some ways wildlife managers may be creating targets below carrying capacity, actually causing a loss of biodiversity. I think highlighted in some of the slides that we saw as well. Can you talk about that article and the practical solutions that they suggested?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about it a little bit. So this article tried to reconstruct densities of herbivores if human impact had not happened prehistorically. So if humans had never existed, what would the density of herbivores look like? And they did this, looking at reference sites like in Africa, where these big megafauna extinctions that I was referencing earlier that happened at the end of the late Pleistocene, 12,000 years ago, almost certainly from human hunting. Those didn't happen in Africa. And so if you look at the biomass of herbivores in places like that, you see tenfold over what we consider natural in North America and in Europe. And that, so it really does change the way we look at a landscape. So a heavily browsed landscape, you don't see it as a failure. You see it as, oh, this is actually really interesting. These heavily browsed trees that are, turned into this dome, this short thing that can't grow up. That's actually, you could think about that as a browsing lawn, of highly nutritious foliage that might be facilitating other herbivores. Just like we see in Africa when these herbivores create grazing lawns. So there's all these processes that we may be considering harms, but it may actually be a way the world once was. And so a lot of this refers to that point I made earlier that, people in the world of conservation that tries to get to certain goals, these goals are often called baselines, and so the baseline people have used is for deer, for instance. We have estimates reconstructed from historical record of how many deer were here when white people arrived. This is what Emma Maris calls the white dude moment. This moment fixed in time when white people land it and a white man writes down how the world is. And then professionals go and refer to this historical account as if it's a Bible, as if the world was always that way and that's how it always should be, which is absolutely ridiculous because these things are always changing. And if you go back far enough in time, there were way more deer. And there are probably times where there are way less, but that's just that's the way of it.
Fascinating. So to sort of wrap up, I guess, when we talk about conservation, you said things are starting to change. People are starting to think differently and understand that that some of the approach is a value or like a religion, and that folks are starting to think about compassionate conservation and promote it as an alternative to our conventional philosophy. Can you just talk a little bit about what is compassionate conservation and how we might integrate it into our own wildlife strategies?
Yeah, so compassionate conservation, the term is very, I think, unsettling at first. I was affronted by it, and I know a lot of people that hear that phrase and they immediately reject it. They think of it as too feely, And it took me a little while to get over that because it took me a little while to realize that conservation itself is a feely term. Conservation itself is, founded on certain ethical postulates, ethical proposals that biodiversity is good, for instance. And when conservation biology was formulated by Michael Soule back in the 80s, it was all about collectives, and it was seen as this crisis discipline to prevent extinctions. And much of that work I completely support, is completely legitimate, but it did not see individual life as having value or being a part of conservation. Now, in the decades since, a lot of the activities of conservation have been focused entirely on killing things, with very dubious outcomes for the larger goals of conservation. And so what compassionate conservation proposes is that individual life does matter, and that compassion could be a virtue that helps guide us through the morass of decisions about how to live on Earth and how to respond to ecological change. And the reason that compassion can be useful is because it forces us to be a little bit more humble, and it forces us to really be serious about what we're doing. If my dog killed 15% of the trilliums in that forest, would you murder my dog? And compassion would keep us from doing that. And I think that's an important thing. And what it lends itself towards is focusing inward as opposed to externalizing our guilt onto other organisms. So instead of focusing on the deer, it makes us ask questions about how we're involved in the way these forests are. If there's a species going extinct, we think not what can we kill, but what are we doing in the bigger picture that might be driving this outcome? And is there a non-lethal way to not only understand, but then to respond? And so many times this means stopping to kill something else. In Australia, for instance, which is really the homeland of compassionate conservation, conservationists are primarily landscape eradicators. That's primarily the work. All the national parks are sowed with 1080 poison bait, which is an excruciating death. And they do this to kill red foxes. And red foxes are, really, they're predators of a lot of these endangered small mammals. In Australia, the small mammal populations have just tanked since the European establishment. And one of the indicators of that is red fox predation. So they put these 1080 baits out to kill foxes, but the 1080 also kills dingoes. And what people have found, and this is very strong, is that if you stop poisoning foxes, dingo packs stabilize and fox populations crash. But if you keep poisoning foxes, dingoes are poisoned as well, and fox populations actually stay very high or higher. So a big part of compassionate conservation is trying to understand how the system works, and then trying to find the interventions, which usually involve changing our behavior, that could lead to that conservation outcomes that will protect collectives and species and populations and processes that we care about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yes, it does make great sense. Well, that brings me to another question then, because you made several points that remind me of the cat hate that we deal with about outdoor cats, and hear a lot about the birds that cats are killing, and there are communities and countries that are have these very lethal, very inhumane programs to kill cats, and we see that lots of recommendation from conservation organizations to kill cats. We have also seen studies that I think get neglected, that the numbers of animals that they are killing are probably overblown or not fully understood. Are they birds that are sick? Are they birds that are dying? And the relationship between the number of birds they're killing versus the number of rodents that they're killing, that people usually like that they're doing. And there was a recent study, somewhat recent, that said that where there are rats present, cats actually provide a protective value for birds because rats invade nests. So the birds actually did better when the cats were present. I just bring that up and want you to comment just again about that factors that we're not considering, and the complexity, and how we might not see in the long run problems that we're creating when we focus and scapegoat and kill one type of animal.
Yeah, there's a lot of dimensions to that. It's a really interesting question. I think the way that we've been taught about cats, the way most people talk about cats, is that they're this kind of essential force that kills birds and rats and kills native biodiversity, right? But cats are ecological actors. They're embedded in a mesh of interactions. I had back in Phoenix, where I did my master's, I had a dog that used the backyard. Maybe you had a dog door, you go in and out, and there are feral cats in the neighborhood, but they never step foot in the yard. So there was the dog in and out, and there were lots of birds. And then my dog died, and cats showed up, and all these rats and mice that had been outside fled inside the house to avoid the cats, which is really interesting. There's this beautiful trophic cascade right in my backyard. And what that also suggests is that these cats are not static organisms. They're not using the landscape equally. The dog was scaring them out of that backyard. There was a great study somewhere in the Midwest that showed that where coyotes are present and abundant, cats are extremely rare. And so if we want to talk about cats, I would say let's talk about what we're doing to the coyotes first, because that is blood on our hands. I worked on an island as well as a conservation biologist, with these endangered birds, and they killed cats. They spent $1 million a year killing cats, night vision scopes, night vision truck, shooting them, poisoning them, trapping them, and to save these 2 endangered birds. They only twice in, I think, 600 dead cats found any bird in the stomach, and they weren't the endangered ones. There was actually no empirical evidence that the cats were having any effect on those 2 bird populations. It was only mice that they were eating. So we sometimes take these stories, these horror stories that come from some unspecified, now forgotten island where cats maybe did cause an extinction, and we apply them to this species across all these ecological contexts, which is just completely non-ecology. That's kind of theology to me. Cats are, responding to environments in very complicated ways, as all species do. And places that have really strong cat effects are going to favor some organisms over others, and that's just the fact of it. I would also make the point that killing cats does not necessarily lead to less cats. On that island I worked on, the killing programs of cats had led to no change in the cat age structure. They were still killing 12 and 14-year-old cats, which suggests that they're having no impact despite spending $1 million a year. There was a study in Tasmania that found that killing cats actually increased cat densities, because for every cat you kill, if you imagine you have a landscape of adult cats, and these are territorial animals, those animals will be guarding territories that are actually kind of large, but if you kill one of them, you get an influx of juvenile cats that are fighting over that territory. And we see this in mountain lions as well, When you kill them, you actually get more. And in the case of mountain lions, the rate of depredation on livestock goes up some 100 or more percent from killing one individual mountain lion. So these effects are not what, this kind of management by numbers suggests, that you just you reduce cats, one less cat is 10 more birds, but it doesn't actually work that way.
That's really interesting. Thank you very much. I want to be able to let folks have some questions for both of you. I'm sure there are burning questions right now. Karen Patterson is here, our Vice President of Humane Education and Volunteers. Karen, do you want to share some questions from the audience?
Yeah, and if you haven't already done so, you could submit a question using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as time allows. We do already have some that are coming in, so we'll begin with those. Just going back to the beginning of the presentation this evening, in regards to surveys that are done with foraging and regeneration, is there an impact or difference at all based on the time of year that you're doing those surveys?
Yes, there are, because you can only do browse surveys in the winter, right? So you can, then you can actually see, or when the leaves are off the trees, that's when you normally do browsing surveys, because that's when you can see the damage on the twigs. During the summer, what you will find, plants can compensate. So if there's leaf damage, and this happens with insects, it also happens with a mammal herbivory. If leaves are eaten off a plant, the plant will compensate and regrow the leaves. A classic example, I don't know if it hit in Michigan, but in adjacent Ontario, in our cottage country in Parry Sound, Ontario, it was devastated this summer by gypsy moth outbreak. We're not supposed to call them gypsy moth anymore. Lymantra outbreak, and devastated the oaks and the pine trees there. And halfway through the summer, they reflushed, right? So there is a compensatory response of the plants, and that's why simply measuring damage isn't a good indicator of the net effect of the herbivore on the system. And so it does really matter. The other thing that I always say is if you were to go in a field in the fall after a farmer has harvested all his plants, you would say he's a damn poor farmer, right? But if you went there in late spring, early summer, you would say, well, what a terrific farmer. And so that sort of gives you a sense. In the growing season, plants have a lot of opportunity to grow, not so much in the dormant season, obviously. And so what you have to do really is think about the year-round life cycle of the plant in order to really get an accurate measure and understanding of what herbivory is doing.
Okay, great, thank you. Continuing kind of on the topic of the studies, the Michigan Department of Natural Resources does not have a recommended deer density for urban areas. The question is, are there any studies in the peer-reviewed literature that have researched the issue of an ideal deer density in urban studies? Or sorry, in urban areas?
This gets back to what we've been trying to say, and Erick, articulated it so well. We can't tell you what an ideal density is. That's a value judgment, right? In terms of management, right? Science can tell you if you have this many deer, this is what the ecosystem might look like. Or if you have this many fewer deer, this is what the world might look like. But we can't tell you what the ideal is. The human community has to come together and decide what is our objective? What should this landscape look like? And then we can tell you what density of deer you need to achieve that objective. That's where the ethics really comes into play here. And I think that often gets confounded. And as Erick said, there's this expectation that the scientists are also the ethicists telling you what to do, what you should do. And that's not the role of science.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thinking about the methods we use to determine deer density, there's flyovers that count deer, and people here are arguing over how many deer there in fact are. Some say the flyovers are not actually counting all the deer. Some say they are. So that said, are you aware of any studies that do show a direct relation between some number of deer and the impacts, or is it always complicated?
You can do, there's no, it's really hard. And this comes into the spatial scale, right? The aerial surveys are done over huge landscapes, and you're sort of averaging over, let's say, 100 square kilometer area. You're flying over doing, you're flying on transects and you're doing counts and everything. But the damage that you're worried about is always localized. And so what ends up happening is you get this bigger scale estimate of numbers that then you attribute to the damage on a local scale. This is, again, as Eric was talking about, we actually really have to pay attention to the heterogeneity on the landscape and really trying to scale from the plot level to the landscape level. So there, right now, there is no direct way of saying there are this many deer in this one area and that number is causing the damage. We have indirect measures like deer pellet surveys, where you estimate, an approximate number based on an average pooping number of times a day or whatever. But that scaling problem leads to issues of really being able to pinpoint saying this many deer are causing exactly this much damage.
I would add also that a deer population of the same size in one area versus another, controlling for the climate, and the productivity could have different impacts because of, their movement rate, their vigilance, because of predators, things like this that are even harder to measure than population size, which is still really awfully hard to measure.
Just to give you an example, because I saw another question sort of, talking about the density in Washtenaw County and all that being in the 100, like over 100, which is an extraordinary density. I've never seen studies where they say there are 100 deer per square mile. I mean, they'd be crawling all over you. In our state, in Connecticut, right? And one of the questions said, well, is the reason I didn't see a trend because I'm dealing with a lower end of the density spectrum. But in our state, actually, what our biologists do, government biologists, they do flyovers, they do the surveys, and they get the numbers that I used. And that's the numbers that they say we got when we counted, but surely we're underestimating. So they just arbitrarily add a fudge factor of 50% more. And they say, well, there are this many, there has to be this many more deer. And so then they report that. They at least account for the fudge factor and say they do that. But then they're basing decisions on a survey averaged upward to make a claim. And so really, according to the state's numbers, I'm dealing with actually a density of maybe 50 down to 5, not 30 down to 5, according to the, the numbers that the biologists in Connecticut use. So, we have to also be careful. A lot of these surveys are done for the sole purpose of proving that you need to do a deer cull, right? Not necessarily testing whether there are sufficient numbers of deer out there that warrant a cull.
Great, good point. Thank you so much. As you can imagine, we have several participants watching tonight that are currently either working with government officials or hoping to share with neighbors or their community, just ways to kind of reframe the conversation and inform people about compassionate conservation. Can either of you share any resources or any kind of tips to help guide those discussions?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of compassionate conservation, there are some great articles. Some of them are kind of academic, but there are some lay people articles too that I could send to the organizers and to be dispersed. Is that would that be the best way?
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. We could send those out in a follow-up email. Absolutely. Thank you.
I would, Eric also alluded to a book by Emma Maris, Rambunctious Gardening. I would recommend people buy that and read it. It's really sobering also.
And her new book, Wild Souls, too, is also bringing in this dimension about what happens to conservation if we consider non-humans to have individual value.
Another question, just kind of thinking about Ann Arbor specifically, a lot of our natural areas are highly fragmented next to homes, commerce, highways, etc. How do pesticides, lawn chemicals, pollution, or even noise and light have an impact on these natural areas?
Well, certainly pesticides are going to affect the soil organisms again, right? And if you lose your microbes and you lose your invertebrates in the soil, you don't get nutrient cycling, and that could be a collapse in regeneration also, right? Again, you're blaming deer for something that's more insidious due to pesticides. Light pollution, light does change animal activity and where they go on the landscape. You know, the what we call the anthropause, which is when everybody did COVID lockdowns, we actually got a glimpse of what animals do. And they're really not scared of human infrastructure. They'll go everywhere on the landscape. Even predators will walk right into the middle of downtown San Diego or San Francisco. It's really the human movement and the activity that scares them away, really. And so whenever we have a lot of lighting going on, or when we have our landscapes built so that humans can be mobile, that's when we drive animal species out of sort of the center part of the urban areas. And this also speaks to another issue that we're discovering, is that, you know, some of the recent counts were done during the anthropause. And so we're seeing extraordinarily high densities of these animals because they are moving into the cities again, because these are good habitats, because people aren't scaring them out or getting them to move away from the centers of these urban areas. Plus, the interesting thing, and this goes back to thinking about behavior, a lot of animals are probably coexisting with us in plain sight, except, you know, they come out at night. They've shifted their activity cycles. Animals that would normally be active during the day end up being active more at night, but they're still in our backyard. They're still coexisting with us. We just don't see them because we're asleep at night. And it's all due because of, you know, we're mostly a daytime creature, and what we do in the daytime causes these animals to shift their behavior.
Oh, great.
Very well said. I can't add to it.
Great, thank you. Just kind of a basic question about deer. What is the home range of suburban does and bucks?
That again will vary depending on the settling stimulus, right? The adjacency between habitat where they can have their green barns to be protected from the thermal environments, and what people do in the surrounding landscape in terms of fertilizing their lawns, growing plants that are deer friendly rather than protecting against deer. So it really depends on, you know, how we manage our landscape. If we manage it in ways where deer aren't finding a lot of concentrations of things locally, they'll expand and move widely. If however we create this candy store for them, then they're going to hang around, and it'll be a small home range.
One more question here. We have quite a few actually, but the next one, based on what was discussed today, how can municipal governments develop practical strategies for managing public woodlands and parks that are visited by deer? The current strategies promoted in Ann Arbor seem to be more oriented towards households, things such as like putting up netting, using hedges, building fences, and things like that.
Again, you know, it's hard to answer questions like that because the goals and objectives aren't specified, right? Like, I mean, we can use, if humans want to recreate, they can use parks with open meadows or open fields, or they can use very densely wooded areas to go walking on trails. So it again, and this is always, we're always trying to sort of put the cart before the horse in a sense. We always want to do something because feeling like doing something means like we're accomplishing something, we're doing good for the environment. But doing something without really saying what it is you want to accomplish isn't effective. It's inefficient. So I think what these municipalities need to do, and it's mostly urban planners that really need to what they need to do, first of all, is think about the urban realm as people and nature together, not just building an environment for people, but also then engaging communities and asking them, what do you want your environment to look like, and have a conversation rather than do the top-down planning and saying, okay, we're going to lay out these neighborhoods this way and everybody has to have a tree in their front yard and they can grow these flowers in their backyard, et cetera, et cetera. And really have an honest conversation. And this gets back to a different kind of ethic instead of compassionate conservation, which is one important ethic, but stewardship is another sort of virtue that we need to inculcate as an ethic also. And stewardship really does involve every citizen being engaged and discussing and coming to a common ground and discussing their different values and sharing values and trying to work together to accomplish outcomes that are all agreed on, rather than divisiveness and always fighting over one extreme or the other, right? And community leaders need to work harder to support that and engage that. Right now, I think we rely too much on government agencies and the top-down planning, and stewardship really requires everybody to participate a little more.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we just have time for maybe one or two more questions. So the next one, have either of you read the studies of Professor Christopher Dick here at the University of Michigan? And if so, do you have any comment on them?
Again, it's hard to say which studies are you referring to, because, you know, as academics, we publish a lot of papers. And so it would be really helpful to know which studies they mean.
Great. Okay, thank you. And I think that that participant, we're happy to get more details if you want to email us that specific question. Sure. Great. Okay, thank you. All right. And so I think we have time for one last question here. Sorry, I just lost my my order I was going in. Let's see. So the city has a Department of Natural Area Preservation, which facilitates the deer call and regularly eliminates non-native species of plants. Some residents are concerned about deer car collisions and are worried that deer are destroying the plantings in their yards and parks. So I guess, again, we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but what are suggestions you have to help people kind of understand that you know, in conversations that deer are not necessarily the root of the issue going on there?
Well, I think, you know, in some cases with deer car collisions, deer are attracted to certain areas for certain reasons, and trying to understand what that is. But we, you know, even if it's sort of not, you know, one of the things that we can do also is educate the public a little bit. So to avoid deer car collisions, what they're doing in other parts of the United States, and Staten Island, for example, and they're now starting in New Jersey, is actually having signage and warning people, you know, in high deer density areas when they're driving through these, warn them that this is a high density area, please slow down and be careful. And it seems to be effective. Again, it's this public education side of things. But so that's a non-lethal intervention, and it allows people to coexist with these deer. But ultimately, trying to figure out why are the deer there to begin with, it could be because, again, you know, these parks are planting plants that are very deer friendly, or, you know, not very nutritious for deer. And so maybe we need to also think our planting strategies and what kinds of vegetation we use as ornamental in gardens and places like that, so that it discourages deer from congregating in an area and staying and feeding in that area. Again, a non-lethal intervention.
Okay. Well, thank you again so much, Dr. Schmitz and Dr. Lundgren, for joining us tonight. Your expertise as some of the world's leaders in ecology is so valuable, and we very much appreciate you sharing this information with us. To all of our participants, we will be providing a recorded link to this presentation via email to those who registered for the event. And along with the presentation, we'll also include some of the resources and data that pertains to coexisting with wildlife and managing human-wildlife conflicts in a humane, effective way. Thank you all of you for joining us tonight, and good night.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. It was an honor.
Thank you so much.